Okay, looks like it's good.
Well, welcome to our Spirited History series. I'm Leanne Ball, your host. Today we're going to be talking about myths and adventures of Johnny Appleseed and America's cider history. And there's a very important role that cider played with our earliest settlers in America, making it one of the top beverages of choice and of need. But first, as I start each of our episodes, I like to tell you a little bit about myself, especially if you're new. I'm a historian and radio host of Spirited History, heard every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Para X Radio Network. I've been doing that since 2008, and we highlight historic sites or unusual paranormal history, and we talk about what makes the site unique and all the legends and lore that surrounds it. I also, for 25 years, was a business owner. I had a business that catered to early childhood educators and students, and I would travel to different locations teaching art, music, science, and history. After about 25 years, I retired and really focused on my passion, which is historic locations. And I became a historic site coordinator for several locations here in Virginia. And now I have focused my energies on Spirited History. It's not only a radio show, but we also have raised over $65,000 for historic preservation throughout the East Coast. And we offer educational programs and lectures such as today. And I also am a researcher for several locations. Right now, I'm working on the enslaved history for two large-scale locations here in Virginia. And yesterday, folks, I got to see my biggest 9-month baby. I've been working on this for a little over a year now, a historic marker for a location here in Virginia. And it finally was finished from the foundry. So I've got to see this incredibly large historic marker that's going to go up in the fall here in Hopewell, Virginia. So I'm very excited about that. Today, we're going to be delving into Johnny Appleseed, a hero of American folklore. Johnny Appleseed was said to be this barefoot wanderer with a tin pot hat and a sack of apples. So he might leave and start trees anywhere he went. But unlike his tale of his colleagues, Paul Bunyan, with a babe with the blue ox, Appleseed's story is really based on a real man. His name was John Chapman, and his real life was far richer and really more interesting than the legends and tall tales that are associated with him. John Chapman was born in Leominster, Massachusetts on September 26, 1774, to Nathaniel and Elizabeth Chapman. He grew up in the midst of the American Revolutionary War, and his father served as a Minuteman in the Battle of Bunker, which is Breed's Hill. He helped construct the defenses of New York against the British invasion with George Washington. While his father would survive the war, Chapman's mother did not. She died in childbirth in July of 1776. Following the death of his wife, Nathaniel Chapman remarried a woman named Lucy Cooley, and they had 10 children. In 1780, Chapman's father returned home and began to teach his son the farming trade. So this is where it begins for our Johnny Appleseed or John Chapman. Overwhelmed by a really chaotic life with his family, John Chapman at age 18 convinced his younger half-brother Nathaniel to roam the West with him. John and Nathaniel reached Ohio when the rest of the Chapman family arrived after them. So they were all going out towards the West. Nathaniel opted to remain with the relatives. Prior to his roaming, John Chapman, at age 13, folks, with the aid of his father, was given an apprenticeship as an orchardist with Mr. Crawford, who managed apple trees. This intensified Chapman's desire and interest in fruit and their growth. His original fascination with apples stemmed from learning about their symbolic importance. Through planting apple trees, Chapman aimed to spread the knowledge while reminding residents of their immorality. So, even at a young age, he has the passion for plants, growth. He's really focusing on the apple because what will happen next in his life and what will be a transition for him is his religious beliefs. Now, this apple is a complex symbol with a variety of meanings that are incorporated into it. It can mean love, it can mean knowledge, wisdom, joy, death, or luxury. And apples also can represent that sort of erotic association with the woman's body. And don't forget, the apple of the Garden of Eden is a symbol of temptation and the original sin. In secular terms, the apple functions as a symbol for the cosmos or totality and that original sin. Chapman then developed as an orchardist and nurseryman, and in the early 1800s was working on his own. Chapman began to wander about 1802, traveling through Pennsylvania, then later through Ohio, harvesting apple nurseries. He constructed fences as part of these nurseries to prevent these seedling trees that he's planting from becoming trampled by animals. While his legend imagines him as this messy nomad, in reality, Chapman was much more pragmatic. Frontier law allowed for people to claim land through the development of a permanent homestead. Such a claim could be made by planting 50 apple trees. He's pretty smart. So, in his travels through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, Chapman would plant these swaths of seeds that would begin an orchard and then sell them to settlers once the land had grown bountiful. This made him quite a land baron as he traveled about 100,000 square miles of Midwestern wilderness and prairie. As we get further into this class, you'll find out just how many acres he owned in his lifetime. The apples that Chapman favored for planting were very small and tart, and they had the nickname of spitters because that's what you'd probably do if you took a bite of them. But this made them ideal for making hard cider, apple jack, vinegars, and then cooking with them so that you could add sugar or honey to make it sweet tasting. Thus, it was a far more valuable crop than just those that you could pick and eat. Um, in the Botany of Desire, written by Michael Pollan, he wrote that up until Prohibition, an apple grown in America was far less likely to be eaten than to wind up in a barrel of cider. In rural areas, cider took the place of not only wine and beer, but of coffee, tea, and even in some cases water, because many times when you're opening up an area, the water isn't potable to drink. It was dangerous, full of bacteria, and cider was safe and delicious. Now, Chapman was noted as wearing these threadbare clothes and a preference for bare feet. But these eccentricities that people may have noticed about him were really more his offerings to his faith, which was the Church of Swedenborg, which was known as the New Church. A Christian denomination that was established in 1787, Chapman sought to save the souls of both the settlers and the American Indians that he encountered. During his travels, he would preach the ideals of this new church. Chapman believed firmly in Emanuel Swedenborg's teachings and became perhaps the most famous of the Swedenborgians. The belief in this new church was basically based upon the idea that God was to be worshiped through one form, Jesus Christ. Chapman taught this form of Christianity to the American Indian tribes that he interacted with and claimed that he was able to convert many of them into this new church. So here we have in our first photo on our slide, this is a multi-day religious camp meeting where these preachers would appeal to the listeners through emotions and really try to connect through what the common people's fears might be. And this was an early form of evangelism in the early 19th century. And over here, this is Reverend John Clowes, who was among one of the first English promoters of this new church. I love this. He kind of looks like Don Quixote, but he's got his sack of seeds to plant. Chapman primarily wore discarded clothing, and he would barter apple saplings for used clothes. The second part of his signature look was that sack of apple seeds, and that's kind of accurate because the church forbade its members from harming God's creation. Chapman became a vocal animal rights activist and vegetarian. Chapman opposed violence of any kind towards humans and animals. He said to have refused campfires because it might kill bugs. Bugs might go into the flames and be burned alive. He also refused to use tree grafting to create his orchards. He believed that that growing technique physically hurt the source of plants. So he carried a large sack of seeds everywhere he traveled. However, his little tin pot hat has not been authenticated. It has showed up in a few diaries and accounts, and I'll get into what I think the pot might be from and why people might associate it as his hat. Another strongly held belief of Chapman's was that marriage wasn't for him. As the Church of Swedenborg promoted abstinence for those unmarried, Chapman remained chaste his entire life, leaving no children to inherit his lands or to sort of keep a handle on the tall tales that sprouted like his trees did about him. Now, in this first photo here in our slide, we have Chapman delivering the good news, fresh from heaven, to a frontier family that he would visit. And often he had certain paths that he would take, and he would barter and try to stay with families. On this second photo, this is actually a Swedenborgian chapbook that was distributed by Chapman. Often these little bound volumes he would share with the families that he would stay with or encounter. So I like to think of him as feeding the mind and the soul as he traveled. He spent and the body too, if you think about the apples. He spent most of his time in Ohio and Richland County near Mansfield. Many of Ohio's first orchards began with saplings from Chapman's nurseries. His trees fed many of Ohio's early settlers as they struggled to establish farms and homes on the frontier. Johnny Appleseed, or John Chapman, eventually owned more than 1,200 acres of land across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and now Illinois. So how did he get his name? Though some may say Chapman picked his name by 1806, it wasn't until after his death in 1845 that the legend of Johnny Appleseed, excuse me, really took off. Considering his distinctive look, you can see here, uncommon views and a contribution to the settling frontier, it's little wonder that his legendary look became so powerful. I have some cider. Now, of course, over the years, he made, excuse me, to seem less entrepreneurial, and the use of his apples kind of played down as he started making his way into children's books, cartoons, and movies. Pardon me. allergy season. So how did Johnny Appleseed's legend begin? Well, we have this woman here to thank for that. Perhaps no person had a greater influence in turning John Chapman's life into legend was that of Rosella Rice. Born in Perrysville, Ohio in 1827, Rice had personal memories of Chapman's visit to her family home when she was a child. In adulthood, Ms. Rice built a career writing fiction for women's magazines like Godey's Lady's Book and Arthur's. Sometimes she would write under her name and sometimes under a pen name, Chatty Brooks or Pipsy Away Potts. Love these names. Along the way, she also wrote down her recollections of the wandering apple tree planter and collected other stories about him from friends and neighbors and people that he had stayed with. She provided material on Chapman for several of the early county histories published in Central Ohio and a sketch of Chapman for another local writer, James McGaw. She was certainly one of the most primary sources. So we owe a lot of the tall tales to Rosella Rice. Rice's depiction of the wandering apple tree planter was thoroughly Victorian. And she would say, quote, "His bruised and bleeding feet now walk the gold-paved streets of the New Jerusalem." Rice proclaimed, "While we so brokenly and crudely narrate the sketch of his life, a life full of labor and pain and unselfishness, humbled, his memory glowing in our hearts, while his deeds live anew every springtime in the fragrance of apple blossoms he loved so well." Rice claimed that virtually every orchard in the settlements came from nurseries of Johnny's planting and described his makeshift and shabby seedling nursery as shrines of natural beauty. Rice proclaimed that she knew where many of these nurseries were and insisted that Chapman planted his trees in natural temples, framed by sweeping arches of giant sycamores, hardly a practical location for raising sun-hungry seedling trees, which these apple trees needed to survive. She also depicted Chapman as a man attuned to his feminine sensibilities. And according to Rice, he liked women better than men. He seemed female in many of his attributes and his likes and dislikes, and he was decidedly womanish. When Chapman would arrive at a pioneer's home, Rosella recalled, he seemed instantly attracted to the company of women and eager to learn about the development of each child since his last appearance. Now, I look at this as he's leading such a solitary life, wandering and doing, planting these nurseries, that I'm sure just the delight of having a human company. And also, if he's trying to convert people to this new church, what better way than to disciple through the heart of the home? For W.D. Haley, the writer who first brought Chapman's story to national stage, Johnny Appleseed's story was clearly a tonic for the unusual, violent, and vulgar frontier fare. And he had no interest in the atrocity of the frontier experience celebrated in a lot of the dime store novels that were being circulated at the time. With Johnny Appleseed's story, he sought to celebrate sublime heroisms than those of human torture, or nobler victories than those of like a tomahawk or scalping with a knife that were in a lot of these dime store novels. A few years later, we have here Lydia Marie Child, another American writer of the Reformists. Bent would publish a poem of Chapman's life titled Appleseed John. And by that point, the trajectory of Appleseed's legend had been fixed. While later writers would add little embellishments to the stories, Johnny Appleseed would always serve as a counterweight to the legends which situated the nation's birth with violence and aggression. The life and writings of Rosella Rice have largely been forgotten, but this one resident of her hometown has been brought to a wider audience, which is Johnny Appleseed or John Chapman. So now we're going to get into a few of the fact or fiction aspects of Johnny Appleseed. Perhaps one of the most persistent tall tales is that John attended Harvard College, graduating with honors, according to some sources. This myth apparently had its origins in purely fictional novel entitled The Quest of John Chapman, published in 1904. This story makes John's father a Massachusetts clerk, and John himself studying ministry at Harvard. The Harvard story was retold, and actually it was put in some of his biographies. I guess they're trying to account for Johnny's remarkable intelligence and understanding of religious doctrines, and they kind of seized upon that aspect and said, oh, he must have been educated at Harvard. The fact is that with a considerable amount of research over the years, no one has been able to turn up any record that he was a student at Harvard. The Quest of John Chapman also provides an example of another reoccurring theme with Johnny Appleseed's myth is this lost love story. Even the earliest of written recollections, some set down only 10 or 15 years after his death, this lost love story. Supposedly there's an unhappy love affair. None of these can be documented, and it may be that a real source for these stories is the desire for storytellers to account for his eccentricities, strange behavior, him being a bachelor and never marrying. In any case, the form of the story, which is most widely told, goes like this. It's in The Quest of Johnny Chapman. He loved one Dorothy Durand, but their two families are bitter enemies. So right here we have sort of the Romeo and Juliet theme. A difference of theological opinions, and the lovers are separated. Durand's moved west, and Johnny set out to search for his beloved. He finally locates the family, only to learn that Dorothy had died shortly before of a broken heart. Other authors follow the same sequence of events, but then change the name of the girl. Henry Pershing, in his biography about Chapman, titled Appleseed in His Time, and this was published in 1930, called her Sarah Crawford and had her reunited with Johnny, but dying on their wedding day. These stories are all closely asserting that he had this lost love, but again, it's a false. It's fiction. In the story of Sarah Crawford dying on the wedding day, they also have Johnny returning to plant apple blossoms on her grave. Here's a fact. Judging from the records available, John's practice to scout a likely location for a nursery and then to beg, buy, or lease a plot on the ground of which he would plant these trees. He would clear the ground, prepare the soil, erect that fence I was talking about to keep out browsing cattle and deer, and plant his seeds. Carefully, he would gather these seed from cider mills and more settled areas, and then reuse those seeds to plant again. If the nursery was to be a major one, Johnny frequently would build a lean-to or rough cabin to provide himself with shelter, or he would arrange through bartering boarding with a nearby farmer. All right, so now we're going to get back to the pan on his head. You'll see a lot of depictions of him wearing this pot on his head. And it's most likely that he wore some type of hat to protect himself from the sun, whether I doubt it was leather because of the way he felt about animals. It probably would have been some type of felt or cloth. You would have to have a pan. If you're traveling, you would have to have something to cook in, to boil things. And I have a feeling that the reason why he had a pot on his head is if you're carrying things, it gets kind of cumbersome if you have multiple things you're trying to carry. And I'm sure he didn't want to put anything in the sack to break up the seeds or damage them. So where would you carry it? On your head? And there it is. That's just my opinion, but I'm thinking if people saw him with a pot on his head, it's probably an easier way to carry it. Another famous story about Johnny Appleseed goes like this. Word about Johnny had spread to the countryside. Who is this kind of gentleman who takes nothing for his help and gives so much? Travelers asked. He is called Johnny Appleseed, said the farmer. They told different stories about him. Some said that when he was traveling between farms, he often would sleep in trees with birds and squirrels. While he was sleeping in a tree, that Johnny Appleseed had his dream. And one summer night, asleep in a big oak tree, Johnny Appleseed dreamed that he could plant trees across America from Ohio to the Pacific Ocean. In his dream, it did come true. Pioneers had forged a new trail, 2,000 miles long from the state of Missouri to the Pacific Ocean, and it was called the Oregon Trail. Johnny Appleseed's dream was to sow as much as possible, as many trees as possible, and here it's coming to fruition. He gave sprouts, apple seeds to many who passed through on their way to the coast, and he told them to plant a few seeds every few miles along the trail. This way, Johnny Appleseed said, the travelers coming later won't get lost since they can find these and follow these apple trees, and then they also won't go hungry along the way. Many travelers thought this a really good idea, and they planted the seeds as they traveled along the trail. Soon many of these trees grew tall. There were apple trees from one end of the trail to the other, but Johnny never did get to see any of them. One very cold and stormy night, a farmer Johnny Appleseed was helping came out to the stable. Johnny, why don't you take a bed in our house tonight? He asked. It's going to be really cold. Thank you, but no, he said. I'll be right in here with the animals to help keep me warm. This strange and wonderful person that was John Chapman really puzzled the farmer. He started to leave and then turned and said, I have a question, Johnny. I can't help but ask you, why have you spent your life giving away and helping to plant apple seeds? Johnny Appleseed paused for a moment and then began to smile. He never told anyone, he said, because some things inside us are hard to explain. But I'll say this, there is no tree on earth like an apple tree. It gives us apples for cider in the fall, preserves in the winter, blossoms in the springtime, and pies in the summer. No fruit is healthier for our bodies. For those reasons, I wanted to grow apples across this great land so that no one would go hungry. You see, I feel like I'm a part of every tree that grows from my seeds. They are like the children I never had, something to leave for the next generation. And someday when I die, I'm still in a small way here. Johnny Appleseed died that very cold night, sleeping on a stack of hay. But he lives in the hearts of all Americans who work hard to build a better country for the next generation. His life's journey and death. John Chapman was not just a sort of promiscuous scatterer of seeds. There are records showing that in the course of his long wanderings, he owned no less than 22 properties, and that was included in that 1,200 acres in several counties and several states. When he died, on one holding, There were 15,000 seedlings that were found. His lands were carefully chosen on sites that had land values that would increase. He cultivated his large plantings of seedlings, carefully resettling the little trees in rows. He built brush fences around the tracks to help protect them from animals at large. In spring of 1845, when Johnny was in his 72nd year, word came that cattle had broken into a certain nursery in northern Indiana, and he felt he had to go to these trees. He returned sick and weary and sought a home from his friend William Worth on the St. Joseph River. He had contracted pneumonia, and back then that had the nickname of the winter plague. A few days later, William Worth reported that the old man had died last night, and it was March 18th, 1845. At the sawmill of Richard Parker, a plain walnut coffin was made for Johnny, John Chapman. He was buried by his friends in a burial plot in David Archer's graveyard, 2.5 miles north of the city of Fort Wayne. And it's just phenomenal that this one man contributed such a vast amount of food and a history for the next generation, and also sharing the word of God through so many people and really living his word. There are a few people that actually walk the walk and talk the talk, and he certainly did. It is said when the news of John Chapman's death reached Washington, D.C., that General Sam Houston, a hero of from Texas, stood in Congress and said, "This old man was one of the most useful citizens of the world in his humble way. He has made a greater contribution to our civilization than we realize. He has left a place that can never be filled. Farewell, dear old eccentric heart. Your labor has been a labor of love, and generations, yet unborn, will rise up and call you blessed." Now, these wonderful apples that were planted by John Chapman also comes into play in our early American history. Only 9 years after the first landing at Plymouth in 1620, European colonists began to plant these apple trees up in Massachusetts. And in colonial America, cider was the most common beverage, and even children drank a diluted form of it. In rural communities, taxes, wages, tithes were also paid in cider. And what's interesting too, if you look back at old church records, you can see that some of the Hastings courts met in the churches, and you'll see their tithes or their taxes might be tobacco, and then in there you'll see cider. It's pretty interesting. Historically, cider is fermented apple juice and was the libation of choice in early colonial America. Cider was already centuries old. It was a tradition in England, and by the time America was settled, the first settlers to the New World brought their cider making knowledge with them. Except for two species, the crab apple, apples were not native to America, nor did they come from seeds. So the extensive seedling orchards planted by early Americans would have produced this bevy of new apple varieties. And this is what John Chapman seized upon, is spreading those westward and in areas where it hadn't been explored or hadn't been planted. Most of these seedling apple types would have been that unpleasing to eat type, the spitters as they're called, but that's what made them excellent for cider. And it was enjoyed as a locally pressed alternative to many of the other beverages that I mentioned earlier. It's hard to overestimate the importance of cider in America. It really did provide vital nutrients in a time when people were eating basically what they could grow and a little bit that they could preserve. And you have to think sanitation back then and bacteria contamination, it was really poorly understood. So, with this type of fermentation that could happen with the cider and making it drinkable very quickly because they weren't waiting for the alcohol content to get really high 5%, 6%. As soon as it hit that low amount of fermentation, it was ready to be drunk. Men and women, even children, drank it regularly. Sailors relied on cider as a protection against scurvy on long voyages. Unpasteurized cider contains a supply of that vitamin C, and it was used in bartering and trade. And it even played a role in early political elections. And I'll show you one coming up. In her book, Every Home a Distillery, VCU professor Sarah Hand Meacham explores just how the first colonists brought their cider making traditions with them in the 17th century when they first settled in Chesapeake, Virginia. This is a swampy area in tidewater, and colonists were really skeptical of that water quality because it would carry disease. Um, so that main source was alcohol and cider. Hey, that's something that could be made rather quickly. They began with a morning glass and would continue with mugs during their meals and breaks throughout the day. These beverages were a source of nutrition. And Meacham writes, women not only consumed alcoholic beverages, but they also cleaned houses, had babies, and used them as beauty products. So, and cider was a considerable part of cooking. So it kind of placed it in firmly in the female domain. As Meacham quotes from an earlier text, it's properly the work and care of the woman, for it is the housework done altogether within doors, where generally lies her charge. Meacham also recounts that women in small planter households made cider just as they made cheese, candles, and other household supplies. This was the practice for small scale farmers, not only for making fruit ciders, but also beer and other fermented beverages from ingredients like molasses. And I know in looking some of the manifests for early Jamestown, when more colonists were coming through, a lot of the women they were looking for is not only hardy women, but women who had cider making skills, so that when they came here, hey, she's a commodity. She's able to make something that we can drink, that we can sell, that we can barter with. So she was highly favored to come. English in the New World cookbooks and pamphlets instructed women in the production of alcoholic beverages, and recipes were valued property, passed down through families from mother to daughter. Women, or alewives as they were called, were often imported as brides, specifically, like I said, for their cider making and brewing skills. And while alcohol production did eventually transition to the male dominated practice, with the rise of beer brewing and a larger scale productions, women were in charge for much longer in this rural community up in New England and in Europe as these cider wives. This was mainly due to the intensity of tobacco production, which kind of diverted the masculine labor. And whereas in other colonies across the ocean, populations were more urban, able to access imports and have the economic markets to support them, rural areas lacked these amenities. Hops, a Dutch induced phenomena, oats, barley, required significant investments of not only time, but land and labor, which those rural farms and the ones that were being first set up were really looking for that quick cash crop, which would be tobacco, and really couldn't spare. Meanwhile, the tools needed for brewing, including bottles, that was hard to find in areas as well and expensive to import. Limited imports really was an issue in the early cider making communities. While women were not economically independent or able to find any power or prestige through cider making, their role in its production and distribution was essential for sustenance for their families, communities, and really creating a legacy for today's women in industry. And I love this. This is an artifact from the 17th century. It's a glass beer mug, and I've never seen one. It's beautiful. You can see where it has the thumb area to hold the top of it. Hard cider. By the end of the 1820s, there was a threat to what John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed had his orchards. It wasn't simply economic and scientific, but it was moral. Fruit from seedling trees had many uses for a family, like I've said, but in a world where more and more farmers grew food to sell rather than consume, seedling orchards came to be seen as just having one purpose: the production of hard cider and cider brandy. Per capita alcohol consumption rates in the United States were among the highest in the world in the 1820s. And then temperance became a movement that emerged to combat evil, the evil of drink. Whiskey and other distilled spirits were the focus of many of the early temperance advocates, as their extremely high alcohol content really made them a bigger threat. Homemade apple cider began its life free from alcohol and then gradually fermented to a content, like I said, 6, maybe 8%. New cider was the term most frequently used for that beverage that had not yet to ferment. When the circuit riding minister Peter Cartwright stopped at an inn for dinner of hot bread, he and his companions washed it down with new cider. It wasn't until they tried to mount their horses to get back on their journey when they realized that refreshing beverage they had so eagerly drank wasn't new. Both men had trouble staying upright on their horses. And because of that alcohol content of cider, it really was enough to ward off bacteria, but it also was pretty potent. And sometimes these distillers, specifically after 1820, really wanted to speed up the fermentation process. So they would top it off with a little corn whiskey, making it more 10 to 12%. That was another common method. Another one would be to leave the barrels outside on a cold night and then scrape off the ice that formed on top of the barrel overnight. And what was left behind was called applejack. And that would double the alcohol content. So the early advocates of temperance viewed hard cider as relatively harmless, even as a helpful alternative to distilled spirits. Benjamin Rush was among the earliest advocates of moderation in the consumption of alcohol and boasted that a crowd of 17,000 who had gathered in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1788, celebrated with nothing but beer and ciders, those invaluable federal liquors in Rush's construction, in contrast to hard liquor, which he associated with anti-federalism. Rush also produced a physical thermometer, assessing various beverages on their health and moral properties. Water, milk, and small beer were at the top of the drinks for a truly temperate, while gin, whiskey, and rum were the beverages of the most dissipated. But Rush placed cider and perry just below the beverages of the truly temperate and suggested their effects weren't not all bad, that they produced cheerfulness, strength, and nourishment when taken only at meals and in moderation quantities. In the earliest years, leading advocates for temperance called moderation in consumption of alcohol and the avoidance of distilled spirits. But as that movement started to gain speed and steam, then there was a push for total abstinence just nothing. Be abstinent, no alcohol at all, which would include our cider. They rejected the view that cider drinking should be tolerated and seen as healthy. A man could get drunk on cider just as surely as he could on whiskey. It takes a long time to make a man a drunkard on cider. One anti cider crusader declared, but when made, he is thoroughly made, is lazy, bloated, stupid, cross, and ugly, wastes his estate, his character, and the happiness of his family. Those who campaigned against hard cider claimed its effect on families was often worse than distilled spirits. He cited a wife of a cider drunkard who had told him that cider made, drunkard, more brutal and a ferocious beast in his family. Rum overcame him quicker, laid him prostrate and helpless on the floor or in a ditch. Cider actually excited him and gave him the rage and the strength of a maniac. So you can see here's our temperance scale and the different things that you want to have. 70% temperance is spring water and milk. See the excesses. I would pause this and then look at the slide to read more in depth. It's pretty interesting. All right, so we'll go on. By the 1820s, early 30s, we really had that temperance movement, and it began to really have an effect on farmers and seedling apple trees. What Shall I Do with My Apples was an article written in 1827. Its author was determined to make cider apple the newest front in the contest between God and Mammon, commonly thought to mean money, material wealth, or an entity that promises wealth and is associated with greed or the pursuit of gain, declaring that this was the question every Christian farmer should be asking themselves. If he gathers his apples, of course he must make them into cider, and if he makes them into cider, of course he must sell it. And if he is to sell it, of course he must sell it to a distiller or procure its distilled, and then sell the brandy. And if the brandy is sold, it must be drunk. And in this way, every barrel will make and circulate liquid fire enough to ruin a soul, if not destroy life. So after a while, they were trying to encourage these Christian farmers to burn these trees. A correspondent in Cincinnati Western Observer said farmers who raised fruit for cider and brandy market would only join the temperance crusade if ever the dictates of consciousness gets the mammon or the outrighteousness out. So we have now a foothold trying to pressure the farmers into not producing cider at all and to actually burn these trees. Now we have to add in the cost of hired hands required to gather all the apples and the effort to get the fruit to the cider mills and the fees for processing them into cider. And that was difficult. A more profitable strategy was for the farmer to let the hogs have those apples that weren't fit for fresh eating or its use into cider. So now they're having pushes to have hog farms along with your apple trees to convert. It can be converted to pork with little effort. By 1829, a few farmers actually had taken that advice to burn the trees, and they did it. It was this whole anti-apple, anti-rye society that was starting to sprout up. Well, here comes our presidential candidate, William Henry Harrison, in 1840. He ran on the log cabin and hard cider campaign. And I just have to tip my glass to that with a little bit of cider. Essentially, he claimed that he was raised in a humble log cabin drinking common cider. It's pretty smart. He's empathizing and making that connection with the local. While his campaign claims were not really accurate, the campaign was a success on so many different levels. Harrison became the ninth president, and the term hard cider became more common in American English. It's now so firmly embedded in our language today, as it is that we almost call all fermented apple juice hard cider. Americans are the only ones in the English-speaking world to really use that term. Everywhere else, it's called cider. Early Americans left off the hard too. From the earliest settlement through the 19th century, it was simply called cider. Years later, Henry David Thoreau bemoaned the loss of seedling apple trees across the New England countryside. He repeated the story he had heard of an orchard in a distant town on a side of a hill where the apples rolled down and laid 4 feet deep against a wall on the lower side. And this owner cut down for fear they should be made into cider. Thoreau was nostalgic for that time when both men ate and drank the apples. Um, it just, I think our John Chapman would probably roll over just thinking of all his children, his little seedlings being mulled down. A number of these orchards were actually chopped down by temperance ultraists. They were likely looking at their religious doctrines and trying to follow through on that. Then Prohibition came along, and in the 1920s, when government outlawed alcohol, Johnny Appleseed had become an American folk hero. But this didn't stop the axes of the FBI agents who tore down orchards to prevent the making of the homemade hooch. Aside from slaughtering Chapman's trees, this also nearly killed America's connection to hard cider, the beverage that was rooted deep in our history and really only recently has had this resurgent in popularity. Are any of his trees still standing? Well, yes. There is a 170 plus year old tree. It's the last known planted one by Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman himself. It grows those tart green apple spitters, and they're used for applesauce and baking and cider making. And it is still making fruit. John Chapman forever changed the apples of America. He created the conditions for apple trees to adapt and thrive in their new world home. It was the seeds, the food produced from apples, the cider that gave the apple the opportunity to discover by trial and error the precise combination of traits required to prosper in this new world. From Chapman's vast plantings of nameless apple seeds came some of the great American cultivars of the 19th century. Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, is alive in every history book, encyclopedia, and dictionary. Buildings, parks, bridges, highways, movies, songs carry his name. Let us never forget. I kind of see him up in an apple tree smiling down. And there's this wonderful quote I found when I was doing research for this, that in helping others, you will find the noblest deed of humankind. And I think he was a very noble man with early on that fire in his belly to have a connection with things that grew and saw the potential that how they could help people and also serve a purpose in his ministry. And I wanted to show you a few things since we have a little bit of time here. There's my thank you. We'll go back to that. But here's another tree that I found in Ohio. And there's one of the actual apples from it. And then this is his Bible. And this is his personal Bible that he did carry with him. And here is a sample of his handwriting. And this is actually sort of a receipt for 8 apple trees. And will you oblige your friend? Mr. Martin. So this is for 8 apple trees. 1818. That is incredible. That still survives. There's also a Johnny Appleseed Educational Center and Museum, which is open by appointment. But when I went to their website to find out more information, it looks like they may be looking for a new location, and it could be due to the pandemic that's been going on. But if you do the Johnny Appleseed Museum.org, you can find out more information about their mission, which is they want to preserve not only the history of John Chapman and Johnny Appleseed, but also cider and the cider making industry. So it really is a noble cause, and you can find out more information by going to johnnyappleseedmuseum.org. There's also a nationalapplemuseum.com that has a lot of information, especially if you're going to do any traveling up in the Ohio area, and gives you some interesting places to check out as well. Go back to there's this Bible, there's the apple. And I have been your host, Leanne Ball with Spirited History. We have our radio show every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the ParaX Radio Network. And if you have any questions, you can send an email to spiritedhistory@gmail.com. And I want to thank you today for journeying through Spirited History. Good night. Goodbye, everybody.
Cider is a noble cause.
Yes, I know. Huzzah!
Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.